Hey there, hunters, and welcome back to the Gunners Guild. Today we're going to take a quick look at 3 build archetypes that got hit the hardest in the Remnant 2 Forgotten Kingdoms DLC pre-patch notes. Obviously, there's a ton of changes in these notes. There's been a lot of talk about what builds are dead, what builds got touched barely, all that jazz. And obviously, we're not going to know everything for sure until we see the new items in the DLC, because that could change all of the trinkets, the traits, the weapons, the mod mutators, all the stuff that we could use in a build, so they could be entirely different. That being said, though, we obviously won't have everything as we go into the DLC and starting to obtain the items and such. So we're going to be looking at builds and where they stand before starting the DLC. So I'm going to show you an idea of what your build performance can look like with the current changes in place. And we're going to be covering the Hugs crit stacking setup, a mod swapper setup, and a dot build. Basically the 3 builds I like to use. Now, there are a ton of other builds that will perform differently, maybe even better, like Havoc Loot, Melee, Full Engineer, but these 3 are some of the big dog archetypes. So we're going to examine them, and let's just dive into this. So we're going to start with the standard Hugs build. Monarch did not get changed, so we're going to be using that as our benchmark weapon to test. With the standard Hugs setup here, this is the base equipment that we pretty much always use. I don't have a ring slot here because that's kind of like a niche item to fill in for your build. And I'm not going to have it, you'll see. But basically, this is what we're using before the patch. Now, we can realistically sustain 5k DPS on the Monarch. Not using the mod just because I want to do straight firing for consistency's sake. And obviously, it's going to be a little bit stronger. But this is pretty standard for a Hugs build right now. And then for reference, here's a list of the nerfs that are directly going to impact this setup, given our current gear. Hunter's Focus is no longer going to give us 10% crit chance. Whetstone lost 15% crit damage. Xania's Malice lost 10% weak spot damage. Probabilities Cord lost 10% crit damage. Relic Fragments lost 2.5% crit chance and 5% crit damage. And Momentum lost 10% crit chance and crit damage. Atonement Fold is a wash because we're going to be using Braided Band still, and that's just going to replace it. But with this total, we have minus 27.5% crit chance, minus 35% crit damage, and minus 10% weak slot damage that we have to make up. So to compensate for the nerfs that are going to hit, we replaced Xania's Malice with Ring of Flawed Beauty, so we lost 5% of our weak spot damage. We took off the Whetstone entirely, which is 30% crit damage and 15% crit chance, and 10% crit chance fragment. So we're going to be down 25% crit chance, 30% crit damage, and 5% weak spot damage. So not quite as much as what the nerfs are going to do, but still. Both of these builds, again, are going to be missing the 1 ring slot because that's just going to be an even wash. It's a utility slot, whatever. But given this setup, just dumping Monarch damage into a target dummy, we're going to drop from 5k DPS over several clips down to 3.5k DPS, which is a pretty large 30% damage loss. And that makes sense given that the crit damage loss is basically 30% and we had 100% crit chance, so yeah, we lost 30% of our multiplicative damage right there. This is obviously not a perfect representation of what the Hugs crit second build is going to look like in the DLC, but it should be fairly close. And yeah, this also isn't going to be a perfectly optimal setup, but again, it should be a scalable test, so if you were doing like 6k damage before, you're probably going to be closer to 4k now. That's all I'm saying. In general, Hugs crit stacking went down about 30% of its damage because it lost that much crit damage. Obviously, if we get more crit damage from DLC gear, that'll go up, but as it stands, 30%. Next up, I have the Mod Swapper build. Now, this is a very niche playstyle, but Mod Swapper is a very strong and probably the best pure mod damage build out there. While the build didn't get any direct damage nerfs, we did get a big nerf to the mod generation. We lost 100% mod generation from Archon's Prime, 25% mod generation from Burden of the Follower. We also lost some of our feedback damage scaling since we did technically lose some of the crit stacking stuff which we were using, and so that's going to make us deal less damage, which is going to generate less mod power, which again is then affected by Archon's Prime less mod power generated, but it does gain 5% more mod generation on feedback, so whatever. We're also going to gain 30 mod power per second, which can be a wild card. We can't accurately replicate that because even like a fairy needle is just 10 mod power per second, but we'll have to see on that. But we also lost 10% mod cost reduction from the Prophecy Mutator. So testing this is going to be a lot harder and definitely not as accurate as Hugs. But basically, here's the idea. With the Mod Swapper setup, using no skills for consistency's sake, we can mod swap and shoot for about 3.5k DPS. I know if we use minions and chaos gates, we're easily going to reach like 5k DPS. But the important thing here is that we can sustain this mod swap loop indefinitely without any problems. Now to replicate the changes for the patch, I swapped my archetype so we lost Archon Prime, which did include the mod generation passive it had. But we also took off White Pawn Stamp Ring to account for the loss of Prophecy, and took off Crit Stacking Rings in place of Cartographer's Ring, and keeping on Burden of the Follower, which is 25% more mod power generation than we will have. Hopefully, that's going to account for some of the passive gain from the Archon Prime, and the extra damage from crits that would feel into feedback. It's not an exact science, that's for sure, but it's got to be pretty close. Anyway, using this setup, basically no, we cannot sustain the mod swap loop. It falls off almost immediately, and you need to be shooting your basic weapons to get the mod charges up to keep the loop going, which is a big DPS loss. And then now also you have to factor in reloading to sustain the rotation where you didn't have to before, so that's a big blow. DPS effectively plummeted and ended up being around 2k DPS, but the real issue is that the sustain isn't there. This test I'm not actually sure on, and I'm definitely going to have to actually test with actual items in game. I'm just not confident that the mod swapper build will be sustainable in the DLC. I could be wrong, I would love to be wrong, it's one of my favorite setups, but right now, it's looking pretty dead. The last build I want to look at is Dots. Dots got hit a lot more than people think. First is that miasma damage is gutted, base 500 damage down to 300. So before, if you had a full ritualist and triple duration with the trait and timekeeper's ring, it would be 6,000 damage over 40 seconds. Now it's 3,600 damage over 40 seconds. So that's going to be 4 dots at 90 DPS each, so 360 DPS for the whole skill. Whereas before, it was 4 dots at 150 DPS each, so 600 DPS. That's a huge drop. Huge drop. They also lost direct damage on Fetid Wounds from 200 damage over 10 seconds to 75. Twisted Wounds went from 200 damage over 10 seconds to 20 seconds, so again, those just got gutted. Tainted Blade, while being the same DPS, is a weaker dot in general since it's over a smaller duration. Energized Net Coil lost 5% of its status damage and will have a weaker explosion due to the Tainted Blade being nerfed. And ENC will also be getting its explosion damage fixed, which means nerf, so that's going to be worse, but we don't know how much yet. And of course, the Ahane Crystal and Singe Ring got their multiplicative modifier removed. So that's just additive buffs now, which is a big change. But anyway, let's look at the build. Here's a pretty basic Ritualist Explorer build. Using skills and relic perks and stuff like that, we can easily sustain about 4 to 4.2k DPS through multiple miasma cycles. It's pretty good. It's a lot of DPS for basically no conditions, as you don't have to worry about weak spots or crits for the most part. Now to simulate the changes to the build, it's going to be a little bit harder. We remove Singe Ring and the Ahane Crystal, and Burden of the Destroyer, and Fetid Wounds. It's a lot. Reason being is that we're still going to be using Miasma, which is a big fat DPS boost in its current state, and Energized Net Coil, which still has really strong explosions and 5% status damage, and we're still using Tainted Blade, which is going to be another big boost to ENC. We did lose a lot of our flat damage, which obviously we'll be able to recoup, but I'm trying to weigh this against the loss of our multiplicative damage, our ENC explosions, and Miasma. So again, not entirely accurate, but you could sim this, but that's a lot of simming with dots and stuff, and that's too hard for me. But anyway, with this setup, our dot damage dropped from about 4 to 4.2k to 2.8k through a few miasma cycles. It'll definitely be better with the patch, I'm sure, but even if I put on like Burden of the Destroyer and Shadow of Misery, which is 30% additive damage, my DPS is still only going to jump to about 3.1k, and that's, keeping miasma on Tainted Blade and ENC. So regardless, dot builds are going to be losing a lot of damage. Again, it looks like to be about 30% of their total damage given our current gear and setup. So yeah, some of the stronger builds out there got hit. A good 30% damage nerf across the top performing builds seems to be like a fairly accurate statement to make. There are of course builds that I haven't looked into just because I don't want to. Deceit is still struggling as far as I hear from Bolt. Fargazer is thankfully dead, and a few other ones got hit. But from the testing I've done, it's safe to say that overall nerf to crit, mod power, and dots is not insignificant. And I really hope we got a bunch of new broken stuff to use in the DLC or thanks to remedy our builds, because while I don't mind the nerfs, we didn't actually get any significant changes to the trinkets, as 5% additive damage boosts here and there are not interesting at all and don't change much in the grand scheme of things. And losing power wouldn't be so bad if we had new mechanics and systems to work out and play with instead. But just a straight damage nerf without any compensation feels pretty bad. But again, we still do have all the new DLC items waiting for us, so we'll have to see. Also, side note, tanky leech builds don't seem to have gotten hit very much. I thought those would have for sure, because, like, yeah, a little bit of bulwark stacking damage got nerfed, and some of the concoctions here and there. But that's not a lot, and those tanky builds can just walk through Apocalypse without any problems and clear the game with no brain cells added. I thought for sure that these would have gotten hit because they feel more problematic than glass cannon builds that the top players use to breeze through the game once they have it figured out. Tank builds just seem to be like training wheels. Anyway, food for thought on that. I may just run super tank build as I go through the DLC for the lulz. But anyway, that's going to be all for me for now. Thank you all for watching. Stay tuned for more Remnant 2 content and DLC stuff. Peace and good luck out there, hunters.